So how would I define religion? That's a very difficult question. It seems like a very easy question to answer, and it's probably the most difficult question to answer. My first impulse when asked that question, or asked by somebody, could you define religion for me, is to say no. And the reason is that it's like asking somebody to define the term poetry or define the term literature, that any definition risks turning into a reification. It risks turning into a category that we invent, and then we forget that we've invented it, so that we measure up something like Marxism and say, well, here's the category definition, this is religion, and this doesn't fit, so it isn't a religion. And so it creates rigid boundaries that I think are unhelpful. But that being said, I think there are a lot of definitions of religion out there, and many of them are helpful. I think it's important for students of religion to study them and to think about what the contributions are and what the limitations are, because there is no perfect definition of religion out there. But I'm a student of Ninian Smart, and I've always found, as problematic as it can be, I always found Ninian's discussion of religion as having many dimensions, as being a multidimensional organism, to be helpful, coupled with Ludwig Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblances. That Ninian said that we can talk about religions as having various dimensions, a social or institutional dimension, an ethical dimension, doctrines or teachings about the nature of reality. There's a mythic or sacred narrative, traditions that go along with religion. There are experiences that people have that they understand to be religious experiences. And finally, there are rituals that people engage in. Later in his life, he added a seventh dimension, what he called the aesthetic or artistic dimension. I wouldn't call that a definition. I would call it a helpful starting point for talking about how religions are structured. What's missing from that definition is the notion of descent, that different groups, for example, Hindu women tell stories that are different from the stories that are told in authoritative texts, for instance, and also the idea of change over time, that religions are constantly changing in a process of change. So I think it's limited, but it's a helpful starting point. And Ninian was always pushing the edge of the boundary on this. So I think he engaged in what he called worldview analysis. And he liked to look at the way, for example, secular humanism, there are sacred narratives, if you will, that belong to a secular humanist tradition. There are ritual elements, or civil religion, that if you look at religions as having various kinds of dynamics, or these kinds of categories, that there are other things other than what we normally recognize as religion as also having these various dimensions. And here's where the whole idea of family resemblances can come in. Just like you might have some resemblance to your brother, but you don't look exactly like your brother. So Marxism has some resemblance to Buddhism, but it doesn't look exactly like Buddhism. But there are some things that overlap. And hence it might be appropriate for somebody who is a student of religion or a scholar of religion to look at the way things that we normally think of as secular discourses, the way in which they start to look a little bit like things that we normally would think of as religions. So that's how I like to start. But ultimately, here I take a page from Zen Buddhism. There's a saying that before you study Zen, a bowl is just a bowl. While you're studying Zen, a bowl is not a bowl. And then after you've been studying Zen, when you've achieved a certain measure of spiritual awakening, a bowl is again a bowl. In other words, you think you know everything before you start. Then when you're in the midst of the study, everything you thought you knew goes out the window. And then at a certain point, you get beyond that to a new level of awareness about it. And I think those of us who've been studying religion for a while don't worry so much about where the boundaries are, because we are willing to be a bit more flexible in terms of the way in which we approach a study of religion. For me, what's important is not defining it, but looking at it and trying to figure out, why are these women, in the case of my own research, why are these women doing this ritual? What's meaningful to them about this? Whether or not it fits my understanding of what religion is just doesn't matter that much to me.